Well, on fresh tracks, Trump has officially declared a national state of emergency in foreign trade. True, some senators, mostly Democrats, disagree with this, but even a couple of Republicans were found. They are trying to vote for the abolition of Trump's emergency powers, so far without success. But Trump needs extraordinary powers to conduct tariffs, as the US trade deficit, according to him, is becoming a chronic disease on a national scale. And it's true. The value of goods that the US imports is much higher than those that the US exports. The country has become more dependent on imports than it can afford. For example, on the eve of Liberation Day, the US trade deficit was historic. And in the coming days from the 5th to the 9th of April, the manufacturer expects the largest weekly trade deficit in US history. Trump considers this situation critical and therefore takes drastic measures and imposes tariffs immediately against 185 countries. This is one of the biggest tariff wars in US history, and the markets didn't like it. The S&P 500 lost $2 trillion in less than 15 minutes, but Bitcoin is holding up much better. In fact, we are just trampling in this corridor, where we have found new support and new resistance. We even bounced off the main support line of everything was early here. As you can see, it was early during all this that she served as the main support. We have already returned to her several times. Apparently, even large tariffs on China, the European Union, Vietnam, Taiwan, Japan, and other countries, in the amount of 20 to 49%, no longer impress Bitcoin. But how were these mutual tariffs calculated? Trump said that since the US is very kind, the tariffs will be imposed at half the rate that countries currently charge the United States. For example, if a country sets a tariff on goods and the United States at 20%, then the United States will set a tariff for it at only 10%. The White House also left some categories of goods that will be subject to tariff benefits. These are copper, medicines, semiconductors, wood products, and of course, energy carriers. Trump also announced tax breaks, the largest in American history. The basic tariff of 10% for all countries will take effect from April 5th, and individual mutual higher tariffs will take effect on April 9th. The tariffs will remain in effect until Trump makes sure that the chronic trade deficit no longer threatens the United States. But why is Trump suddenly so kind, and why is he so altruistic? That he will only charge half of the tariffs that other countries have imposed on America. Well, first of all, these 34% that Trump is imposing against China actually turns into 54%. Since China has already had tariffs of 20%, so that's 34% over what it was. And this means that the final tariff is 54%, and this is confirmed by the US Treasury Secretary Besson. And now the most interesting thing. The formula for calculating these tariffs. Trump used trade deficit data to determine the size of the tariff, rather than the actual import duties that other countries imposed on the United States. And this leads, for the most part, to higher tariff rates than they actually are. In other words, the United States of America did not take the tariff rate of other countries and did not introduce half of it. They took the trade deficit with a particular country, divided it by imports from that particular country, multiplied by 100%, and got 67%, for example for China. 67% divided by 2 is already 34%. That's how they calculated it all, and that's how they got all these tariffs that they impose against the rest of the countries. And this is what these calculations look like for the rest of the countries: Vietnam, Taiwan, Japan, European Union countries. And it turns out that this row, these are not tariffs imposed by other countries against the United States, but the numbers derived from this formula. And already from this number, Trump took half as a friendly gesture. This is a big deception that will have consequences. Well, the consequences are already coming. The European Union is preparing further retaliatory measures against the recently announced duties of 20% by the United States, CNBC reports. For example, European officials are discussing maintaining barriers to the import of American services. It is services, not goods. However, the European Union leaves room for negotiations, and these countermeasures will be taken only if the negotiations fail. Earlier, this country has already tried to mitigate the consequences of the US tariff war by reducing its own duties on the United States. For example, they have reduced duties on cars from 64% to 32% and on ethanol from 10% to 5%. However, this did not help much, and in return, they received 46% of the duty from the United States. And finally, the most important player, China, claims that the US trade war tariffs threaten the global economy. And China promises to strike back and launch large-scale countermeasures to paralyze the US economy and promote Beijing's interests abroad. China has its own tools for this. For example, they can artificially weaken, devalue the yuan. This is a topic for a separate video. Against this background, China is looking for a company to spend time with, and this company is very amazing. South Korea, China and Japan are agreeing to cooperate to hold comprehensive high-level talks to improve free trade in the region. Amid concerns over Trump's tariffs, let's discuss countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, and all the others that are just below. And they now have the highest duties from Trump, while Latin American countries have only a base rate of 10%. For example, the largest Swiss investment bank, UBS, predicts an increase in inflation in the United States to 5%. Against this background, the Federal Bank of Atlanta has reduced the forecast of US GDP for the first quarter of 2025 year. And now their forecast is minus 3.7%. And note how much they have worsened their forecasts over the past month. On the 1st of March, they predicted a contraction of the economy by 1.5%, on the 20th of March, by 2.8%, and, finally, on the 1st of April, their forecast was minus 3.7%. In total, the largest banks predict a fall in US GDP and an increase in inflation in the US at the same time. And all this leads to the fact that the yield of 10-year Treasury bonds fell to 4% at the beginning of April 2025 year. This is the lowest level since October last year. This indicates that investors are afraid of a recession or inflation, or maybe both. That's why they run into bonds. And this leads to the fact that we are seeing the first signs of an inversion of the yield of 2-year and 10-year bonds. Historically, a recession begins exactly after the reversal of the inversion, and not during it. Why is this inversion happening? Because financial markets expect that the US Federal Reserve will soon be forced to sharply lower rates, which happens only in the event of a crisis or recession. It seems that President Trump and Finance Minister Besson are quite against a recession for the sake of lowering rates. And Paul's cautious and data-oriented position leaves them no choice. We need to get Paul to lower the rates, and in order to do this, we need hard data to be bad for him. Trump does not look at the stock market at all and says that tariffs will make the United States very strong. You just need to be patient. And Besson called the market decline a problem for the Magnificent Seven company, not the Republican Party. Apparently, they decided to ignore short-term pain for the sake of long-term profits and do everything to make this rate finally fall. And here we see a technical head and shoulders figure, which usually indicates a trend reversal. Perhaps we will see a drop to 3.5% here. And as the Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises said, artificial economic growth due to credit pumping inevitably leads to a crisis. The only question is when exactly it will come. Sooner, if the authorities themselves stop printing money and inflating bubbles, or later, if the crisis is brought to the limit, which will lead to the collapse of the entire monetary system. And apparently Trump decided that sooner is better than later, although even this earlier, as for me, comes with an obvious delay. Therefore, there remains only one logical question. Will Trump succeed in successfully completing his experiment or not? Reporter asks. Trump's tariff trade team is confident that all of this will work, but what if they're wrong? The White House responds, they won't make a mistake, it will work. And the question arises whether this generation will not become a new lost generation, as it was here and here, when we were at the same levels about the location of households in American stocks. The S&P 500 also hints at another crisis like the coronavirus or dot-coms. And Bitcoin is wondering exactly how to close this April. And we need that pink line to come back above the black one. Because in the past, as you can see, when it started lower and did not come back, it led to the fact that the price of Bitcoin reached a peak. Therefore, April will be a very important month. But by the way, Bitcoin looks pretty strong considering what's going on. And I'll just remind you that fear and uncertainty, which are now at their peak, cause millions of people to lose money every year. On the stock market, which has been growing almost continuously for 2 decades.